All right. So today we are going to be learning about JavaScript. The lingua franca of the web. It's the only language you have available in browsers. So it's very important. So we're going to learn about it. So I don't want to bore you too much with the history of JavaScript, but basically JavaScript was created over the course of like a week in the mid-90s by a guy named Brendan Eich. It's created originally for, was it the Netscape browser? So, back when that was actually a web browser. So to give you an idea, this was kind of built a long time ago by one guy under time constraints, and now we have to deal with it today. So it was made in a hurry and has some interesting design choices in it that many people, feel strongly about, don't exactly like. And there are definitely good reasons why some people prefer other programming languages over JavaScript that were more purposely designed. But still, JavaScript is the only option available to you if you want to build a front-end website. If you want to run code in a browser, you need to know JavaScript. And incidentally, I've spent a lot of time working with JavaScript, so I actually really like it. I know all of its quirks inside and out, so I think it's fun, but I won't hold it against you if you prefer Python. So let's see. The only language available on the front end. And as of recently, you can also use JavaScript for servers. So Node.js, which maybe we've heard of, is, they call it a different runtime environment for JavaScript. It's essentially the same language, but it's JavaScript that's running in your server at the command line, basically, instead of in the browser. So that enables you to basically make a full web application with just JavaScript, front end and back end. That's not what we're going to be doing here. We're going to be learning Python for our back end language, and then JavaScript is only going to be our front end. But for these challenges that we'll be doing in the first part of our course, we're going to be using Node.js occasionally so that we can just run our little JavaScript scripts at the command line. And we don't always need to, create an index.html file and run in our browser. We just did that for the def grandma exercise to get the prompt, make things a little bit easier for us. All right, so let's get into some actual meat here about writing some actual code. What can we do with JavaScript? So I think the first thing that you need to understand when you're learning any programming language are the types available to you in that programming language. Now, when I'm talking about types, I kind of like to compare this to spoken languages. There are certain similarities between programming languages and spoken languages. So we say in English, a sentence is composed of multiple words. And each of these words has a different part of speech, like a noun, verb, or an adjective. And this part of speech determines how these words can be combined with each other. Sentences usually have a specific structure, noun, subject, verb, object, whatever. So in JavaScript, a statement is composed mostly of values, and each value has a type, such as number, string, Boolean. I'll just list them out. Null, undefined. Yeah, so those are our basic JavaScript types. So as we're starting out learning JavaScript here, I'm going to really emphasize the different types of our values and the different things that we can do with these values based on their types. And going forward, as you're writing your own code, as you're debugging your programs, especially the most important thing to understand is the types of your values. So if your program isn't doing what you think it should be doing, probably the first thing I would recommend is check the types of all the values, your inputs and your output. Are they at least the type that you think they should be? You shouldn't be processing strings when you're expecting numbers, for example. So let's talk about the different types that we have in JavaScript. So I just listed them out here. The first one I want to show you are, let's actually start with numbers. They're a little bit simpler. So numbers, I'm sure you've seen numbers in JavaScript. 8 is a number. 4 plus 4 will also get you a number. But actually, let's back up here a little bit. There are a lot of ways that you could potentially write a number in a programming language. But what I first want to show you is just a number literal, which is the simplest, most straightforward way that you can write a number. So that's just like 8. So that is a number literal. Now I could also say something like var number equals 10. And then we might also say that the number, this is a number, but it's a non-literal number. It doesn't look like a numeral. So you see what I'm saying? When you're typing out like the actual thing itself, not just referring to it, we say that's a literal value. So this is a term that you should be familiar with, a literal value in programming. So let's actually write some code that we can execute though. So yeah, this is hopefully all reviewed you. Say var x equals 10. Console log x minus 5 should show us 5, unless I've completely forgotten how to program. Yeah, great, amazing. So just here, you've seen me assign a number to a variable, but we're going to cover variables more in depth in a few minutes, so don't worry about that too much. And I've logged this math here just to show it on the console. We're going to talk about functions more and console logging in particular, so don't worry about that. But what I want to focus on now is this symbol here in between the X and the 5. So what do we call this guy?
Minus?
Sure. This is a minus sign.
Negative?
So now, more generally speaking, though,
Operator.
what do we call a symbol that we can put between two numbers and operate on them?
Operator.
Yeah, I kind of gave it away there, but the minus sign here is an operator. So for every type in a programming language, there are potentially multiple operators that you can use to affect them. So for our numbers, we have a lot of arithmetic operators. You're probably familiar with these, so I'm not going to review them in depth, but plus, minus, multiplication, division. I'm going to throw a slightly trickier one at you. Has anyone seen this operator?
Yeah, modulo.
Yeah, can you explain to me what this does?
Yeah, so a modulo is where you give it two numbers and then it'll grab the remainder. And if there's no remainder, you get 0.
Yeah. So let's get a demonstration of that. This is a pretty good one to be familiar with. So I want to just console.log 21 mod 10. This is how you say this, 21 mod 10. What value are we expecting to see in our console as a result of this?
A 1.
Yeah. So 21 divided by 10, 10 goes in evenly twice, and then we have 1 left over. So that's going to be the remainder. This is useful for like time math, I guess. I see interview questions a lot where they'll ask you, you know, after 4 hours and 30 minutes, like where are the hands going to be on this analog clock or whatever. And so it's just a bunch of modulus math, knowing that the hands like spin around multiple times. This also comes up a lot. There's a programming problem, FizzBuzz. Has anyone heard that before?
Yeah, it was
We
one of
are
the bonus challenges for the application.
Okay, yeah. So that's probably not the last time you're going to be asked to write that. For whatever reason, it's a very popular programming challenge, especially for like junior developers. And really all it's testing you on is like, you know, do you know what an if statement is? And can you write a loop? But also, do you know what the modulus operator is? That's essentially what that question is testing you on. So it's good to understand how it works, that you can like whip this out as needed if someone asks you a question that calls for it. All right, so more specifically, all of these operators we've shown here, these are also called binary operators because they operate on 2 operands. So an operand is just something you operate on. You know, in order to do addition, you can't just do addition with 1 number. You know, I can't say 2 plus, that doesn't mean anything. You have to have 2 numbers. So this is called a binary operator. We'll learn about other kinds of operators that take different numbers of arguments later. Let's see. So one other thing that I have to say about numbers is that sometimes you might care about the distinction between floating point numbers meaning it has a decimal point, or an integer, which has no decimal point. So it's important to be aware of these differences just so you're mathematically literate. But in JavaScript, actually, these are not different types. So this is kind of one of those things that people don't like about JavaScript, I suppose, is that there's only one type for numbers, and it encompasses all the different numbers. So decimals, integers, whole numbers, whatever, they're just numbers in JavaScript. Skylar?
Yeah, so then double wouldn't exist in JavaScript, for instance,
Correct.
then. Okay, all right.
Just numbers. So yeah, like in C++, maybe there's a whole bunch of different types of numbers depending on whether it's an integer or a floating point number, if it's potentially negative, depending on how big it is, different types. JavaScript is much simpler. It's, it was built in a week basically to just change the colors of text on a website. It's really kind of like an accident, I suppose, that JavaScript has become so important and so powerful. Yep.
So if all the numbers are bundled into the same type, so to speak, I know that there's circumstances where if you do simple math, so to speak, on a computer, where you have 2 whole numbers and you do an operand to them, the way the computer does the math, it'll end up coming out as like a long decimal with like, 7 decimals and 0.99998, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Or it won't come out evenly because of the way the binary works to some extent. How does Java deal with that? Do you actually get that weird answer that you now have to deal with this floating point that you have to round up?
That's a great question. So JavaScript does not deal with that.
Oh, good.
Get a load of this. Amazing.
Yeah, there you go.
So that's actually an excellent question. And remembering this will serve you well in the first assessment, hint, hint. So JavaScript really struggles with this like floating point math. There are some situations where it just can't like do it precisely. So some people would say that, the difference between 0.3 and 0.30004 doesn't really matter. But the point is that you can't balance a checkbook. Like you can't move a penny, from one bag to another and then back to the original bag and then have what you started with. You can't like say that two things are equal when it should be the exact same amount of money.
And if you're doing millions of transactions, that could add up potentially.
Right.
Or yeah.
But even more than it like adding up, it just makes it hard to like verify that your program is running correctly. Like you want to test that some financial calculation is done correctly, you might write a test saying, okay, if I put in these inputs, the end result should be $3.50. But you're not going to write a test that asserts that the correct answer is $3.50 0.0001, because that like doesn't really make sense. Like you need the program to be outputting reliable, correct output that you can like test against. So this just doesn't make sense. So you might have to like round it down at some point, or what I actually prefer doing is just doing all the math in integers. So, spoilers, if you have to do financial math in JavaScript, I would prefer to do all the math in pennies, so you can actually be adding integers together. Whereas if you try to do it in dollars and then you represent cents using decimals like this, you're going to end up with some floating point problems, kind of like that.
That makes sense. So you're using whole numbers for pennies and then you just divide by your denomination. Are there other kind of rules of thumb, I guess, that people tend to use in JavaScript to avoid these issues if they are using decimals? Like every time somebody uses a decimal, do they wrap it in like a, I don't know what kind of function exists in JavaScript for that, but like int, some sort of boundary?
Maybe. I mean, it depends what you're doing. Like sometimes this doesn't matter. Like if you're comparing quantities of fluids and you just want to know which one's bigger than the other, this isn't going to be a problem for that.
Sure.
So you just have to consider the problem you're trying to solve. But in a lot of cases, the solution is that you shouldn't be using JavaScript if you're like trying to do something mathematical that you think JavaScript is not very well suited to. We might see this later, actually, how Python is much more well suited to doing complex math. And so part of that is the language itself. Python is like, just has some more built-in tools for doing math. But part of it is also just the culture and the community. It's the kinds of people who write Python like doing math. And so they write tools in Python to do better math. Whereas the kinds of people who write JavaScript just don't like math. So there aren't a lot of like math tools written in JavaScript. Okay, so that's about as much as I have to say about numbers for right now. I would like to talk about strings a little bit, unless anyone has any more questions about numbers.
I threw in a link for the. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Oh, okay. I threw a link for the math round. I don't know if we're allowed to use that, but I have used that in the past. So it's in the chat.
You're certainly allowed to use it. it won't always solve problems as well as you think it might.
Oh, right,
Um,
yeah. I would not use JavaScript like you said. I 100% agree with that.
Yeah, like math.round is nice, I think, like on the final step, right before you show the answer to a user, just so that you make sure it looks pretty. But I would be kind of afraid of like repeatedly using math.round in the middle of your calculations just to make sure you always like are at 2 decimal places. That maybe could also work, but it just looks kind of funny to me. It makes me a little suspicious.
Can you do like a short example of like a financial problem that you mentioned doing pennies, not dollars or whatever? Can you give like a super short example of what you mean by that?
It's a little bit hard because the only example I can think of is the actual first assessment that is on my mind. And
Yeah,
I
that's
just,
a good one.
shouldn't spoil it. For you.
We're all fine with
You
that.
you can use the one you used, right? So 0.2 plus 0.1 would just be 20 plus 10. And then at the end, you just divide by 100, right? 20 cents, 10 cents rather than 0.2.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's how you do it.
You're just moving the decimal over by 2.
Yeah, so I mean, if you want to see that written out more verbosely, could write something like, I don't know.
I think related to what you're saying, I definitely saw something somewhere with this where you just multiply it by like whatever factor of 10 you needed to make it an integer and then divide it back by that same amount at the end or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
I think Skylar pointed out, but would this be something that you could just solve by just finding a library that deals with stuff to make it better that someone's created on their own or something like that? Or would you just have to like do some funky stuff around it?
I'm not sure if such a library exists for JavaScript. Oh, it's Math.js. That's probably a good bet.
It just seems like taking something that it's not supposed to do and making it do it when there's already another language that does it very well.
I haven't seen this before. I might have to check it out.
Sorry,
This might
can you
be-
correct me with this? But from what I've heard is, I think one of the problems that the floating point math is not always consistent from a computer to another computer. So it can change, vary a little bit. So I think that's one of the big problems in doing these things with JavaScript.
So anyways, this is definitely really verbose and kind of dumb, pretty simple. There's probably a more concise, elegant way to write this, but this is at least very clear and straightforward, just kind of the logic. You've got your payments as dollars. You want to convert them into pennies, so you multiply them by 100. And you can add the pennies together, and then at the end, you can divide it by 100, and that should give you your total in dollars. So it's workable, but just a few extra steps.
So one quick question about libraries in general. So with employment, I'm assuming everyone has to have the same libraries installed, right? Like you couldn't just do something that would help yourself out, like to make it work better for what you're trying to do. You'd have to have your entire team have the same exact library for everyone to have it work correctly, right?
Right. The libraries are installed in the project itself. So they're not like saved in Git exactly, but Git, excuse me, we'll keep track of which libraries the project uses. We'll cover that later on, but yeah, you're absolutely right that everyone needs to have the same libraries when they're building the same project, but it's not like stored on your local machine or whatever. That's going to be specific to the project. Have you installed libraries before?
Not really. I'm pretty new to all this. So I'm just trying to figure it out because I wasn't sure if it was like local or if it was something that would just put on GitHub or something. I'm not really sure.
So this is kind of an interesting question because it's a little bit different between JavaScript and Python. In JavaScript, when you install a library, it's local to the project that you're working on, which is great. That's exactly what we want because we want to use separate libraries for separate projects. In Python, that is not the case by default. By default in Python, libraries are installed globally to your whole system, which is not what we want. So we're going to have to jump through a couple of extra hoops when we start working with Python libraries to make sure that they are isolated only to the one project we're working on at that time. But that's looking ahead a little bit. All right, so let's talk about strings. So strings are another basic type. It's another primitive type in JavaScript. I guess I should say that there are two types of types in JavaScript. There are primitive types and non-primitive types. That's these guys. And then these guys are complex. Let me write this a little bit differently. Okay, we got primitive types and complex ones. So the complex types can like contain other primitive types or other complex types. So like an object can contain an array which contains numbers and strings, but strings do not contain Booleans, numbers don't contain strings, stuff like that. So some of these are more fundamental than others. All right, so strings. So strings are basically just letters or really any character. We put them in between quotation marks to make a literal string. So that there, put two apostrophes or single quotes, and then any text in between them. And that is a literal string. This is the simplest, most straightforward way that you can represent a string in JavaScript. You can also have a string with double quotes. And so that's exactly the same as a string with single quotes. There's no functional difference in JavaScript between single quotes and double quotes, but it is useful just having both of them. So you have options. Now, let me show you what I mean here. Say I want to say the string don't do it. So try to create this string in single quotes, but I'm getting this red squiggly underneath here. Can anyone tell me what? That's not the button I meant to press.
Because it thinks you're trying to end the string early when you put the don't, and then everything else is just, it doesn't know what normal letters are. It needs it to be in a string or in like some type of variable to read what it is.
That's exactly right. So I've got this apostrophe opening the string, and I want to have an apostrophe as my contraction for don't. But because that's how I open the string, it now closes it. And then these letters are just kind of hanging out, doing nothing. This is invalid code. JavaScript doesn't know what that is. So if I try to run that, I'm going to get an error. It tells me a syntax error. So my syntax was incorrect. However, the error message itself is not quite correct. the issue is not just that I was missing an end parenthesis, but that I prematurely closed my string. Sometimes JavaScript knows where something went wrong, but not exactly what. That's part of the problem with JavaScript because it's such a permissive and flexible language. It kind of lets you do anything until it absolutely can't. Sometimes when things really go wrong and completely break and JavaScript crashes, it's not really sure what the mistake was that you made. Whereas Python is going to be a little bit more strict. And so when you do something dumb, Python is going to like crash immediately and say like, you can't do that, fix your stuff. So anyways, since I want to have this apostrophe in here, there's actually two options here. So simplest option is just to use different quotes. So I've got the double quotes encasing the string, and then I can have the apostrophe inside of it. One other option, if you don't want to do that for some reason, is you can escape the apostrophe. So I'm going to put a backslash in front of it. And what that does is we call it escaping the apostrophe, which basically means, in this case, that it removes the special meaning from that end quote.
Or it can like establish a special meaning, right? Like backslash and or whatever does the new line or all the other kind of stuff. So it's dependent on what you do, right?
Right. So let me make a note about that here real quick. So what I showed you first is when you take a character that has some special meaning, escaping it can give it no meaning and make it just a regular character. So
And if you wanted to
don't
type
do that.
could you
Pardon?
double backslash to print that escape key or whatever? So it would escape the meaning of the escape or whatever.
Can you say that again?
Can you double backslash if you wanted to actually print a backslash because it would escape the meaning of the escape key or whatever?
Yeah. So let's see here. So that's gonna show don't do it. And if we put another backslash in here. Okay, so this is broken because here the first backslash is escaping the second backslash, which means that this one is just a regular character. So the apostrophe is an actual apostrophe, which ends the string. So this is broken again. But now if I put a third backslash in here, then this first backslash is escaping the second one to make it do nothing. But then this third one is actually a real backslash, which escapes the apostrophe, causing it to be a regular character so we can continue our string. Yeah, so that's how you actually print a backslash in a string, which is not something you commonly need to do. So don't worry about this too much. There's an XKCD comic for this. So yeah, that's a really great question and like kind of a hilarious topic. Just like printing multiple backslashes is very complicated. Like if you wanted to print 3 backslashes in a row, I don't know how many backslashes you'd have to actually type to make it visually appear like that. Thankfully, that's not something you have to do very often, so I wouldn't worry about it. Yeah, so as I was saying, escaping can mean one of two things: turn a character with a special meaning into just a regular character. So it removes the special meaning from the apostrophe. Also, a regular character. So for example, you see \n, that's a new line. Less commonly, \t is a tab character. And there are others that I can't remember right now. Um, so let's see. Let's see if we can see those. Cool. So for my second console log here, line \n break, we don't actually see a \n anywhere in this string. It just actually creates a line break. Normally, a single console log will always be on one line, but since I've explicitly put a new line character into this console log, it actually breaks the line when it logs to the console.
Another little random question. So yesterday I was doing the freaking bottles or whatever, and I was gonna do the new line, but I just tried to enter and have it like just press enter, so the console log was like that, and it actually printed like how it's supposed to. So can you just avoid that, or should you just try to avoid that because it could be misconstrued by JavaScript, and just always use, like, as good practice, the \n whenever you're doing a new line?
I'm sorry, how did you?
I just pressed enter, like I just typed it, pressed enter, and it continued on the next line, and it printed it correctly, like when it went through.
You mean like this?
Yeah, like it was over each other, like properly how it was supposed to be, instead of just running it.
I think you mean to put two console logs. At least that's what I got from it.
So there's no way I can break the line like with the enter character in my editor and have this still be a valid string, at least not with these single quotation mark strings.
It works with backtext.
So let's learn about those. So this is actually one of my favorite modern JavaScript features. This was added to the language maybe 4 years ago, 3-4 years ago or something. All blurs together. But so there is a third way that you can declare strings in JavaScript. Aside from single quotes or double quotes, is backticks. So there are a bunch of nifty things about backtick strings. They have actually a handful of different features beyond what other strings can do. And I'm just going to show you maybe 2 things that are neat about them. But first of all, you can write them on multiple lines, which is great. So if you're trying to print like a haiku or something, so here's my beautiful poem. Let's comment out some of those guys. But yeah, so you can see in the console log, it is actually broken down on multiple lines. The only thing that's kind of unfortunate about this is that I indented the text here just to make it easier to read in my editor, but that actually also shows up at the console log. So I would have to write it like that, which in my opinion looks kind of ugly. And then it actually appears on the left margin. So sometimes that doesn't matter. But
It's
if
even
you
worse
wanna-
because in this, it gives the line break at the beginning and the end too. So you want to get rid of that, it looks even worse. Because you started on a new line, it gives the line break and before and after the poem. You'd have to write the first line right after the backtick, and then the last backtick would have to come immediately after the please in order to have it all, which makes it look even worse. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's kind of a pain in the ass, but it's a nice feature.
it is a nice feature. And often enough, it doesn't matter that there's like extra space in here. This is a perfectly fine way to store a string. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about string operators. So actually I said operators, I'm gonna only show you one. So does anyone know, what do we call this?
Concatenation.
Yes, that was the correct answer. So I know you've seen this plus sign before. It looks familiar. You want to say that you're adding strings. That's not what we're doing, because addition is a numerical operation. Plus is a numerical operator. So in this case, this is concatenation. Another way to describe what we're seeing, we can say that the plus sign is overloaded. I'm going to capitalize this actually. So the plus sign performs different actions depending on the types of its operands. If you have like a string plus a string, you're concatenating them. If you have a number plus a number, you are adding them. So let's see what that looks like. Of course, I have to have a space at the end of the string. Otherwise, these words are just going to be mashed up together. That's not how you spell. Okay, great. So we can see that it prints out as one string. It has concatenated them together. That's great. But this is kind of ugly. Were a lot of people doing this the other day with the def grandma or the 99 bottles of beer exercise, just concatenating a lot of strings? Something like this. Does this look familiar to anybody? So it used to be that that was, just the best way that we could combine strings in JavaScript. Sometimes you just have multiple variables and you need to get them into one string. But there is a better way to do that now that we have backtick strings. So I'm going to show you this nifty technique. It's probably going to come in handy soon enough. So let's say so does anybody know what this technique is called here?
String.
I believe it's called string interpolation.
Yes, this is string interpolation. So what that basically means is I'm putting a string inside of another string. So I've got these variables here, greeting and place. And if I want to put a variable inside of a backtick string, this is the syntax for it. Use this $brace and then the name of the variable inside of it. And then when we print it out, hang on a second. There we go. So when we print it out, it interpolates the strings, it puts them into our bigger string. We even get this little period at the end because that's not a variable, that's just a literal dot character. So in my opinion, this is a much cleaner, much cleaner way to write complex strings. It's much easier to read, easier to write. So this is probably something you'll prefer. And there are other things you can do with backtick strings, but I think that this is one of the best features of them. One of my favorite features of backtick strings, what I use the most, I'd say.
Also, isn't there less risk of some type of confusion with JavaScript? Because doesn't it try to interpret the same type of values as potentially multiple things depending on the context? So it'll be like this string is technically a number one or a true, depending on the case, because it has like letters in it versus being empty, and it could just translate something wrong when you're doing the other way with just concatenation.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So let's explore for a little bit. What happens if I what happens if we add 4 plus 4? So is this going to be addition or concatenation?
Concatenation?
Yeah. So this is another one of those reasons why people don't like JavaScript, is that you can ask it to do things that don't make any sense and it will try its best without complaining. So in a lot of programming languages, like I'm pretty sure Python, if you try to do like 4 plus the string 4, it's just going to yell at you and be like, that doesn't make any sense. Like figure out what you're trying to do and get back to me. But JavaScript is like, okay, I don't know what you're trying to do, but I'll do my best. I'll figure it out. And so since you can't actually compare values of different types, what JavaScript will do is it will convert both of them to be the same type. In this case, that means converting the number into a string. Most commonly, when you try to combine different types together, JavaScript will have to automatically convert everything into strings, and then it's going to try to do what you asked.
And is that because the string is the safest conversion? Like you could have a string with letters in it, and it definitely cannot convert that to a number. So it can convert everything to a string, though. So that's why it does.
Yeah,
Okay.
There's always a way to convert things to a string. It's not clear if there's always a way to convert things to numbers.
Does that reduce the efficiency of JavaScript too? So it's trying to like, is it doing like in its core, like a bunch of like if else statements for each situation to determine if it makes sense or what's the best course or whatever the hell for it? Like, doesn't that waste a lot of processing power, whatever the fuck, or make it inefficient?
I don't want to say a lot. You know, it's an extra step that has to be done somewhere. But I'd say that if your website is slow, it's not because of type conversion like this, and using a different language that doesn't perform type conversion is not going to be the solution to your problem. So maybe there's something there, but I think it's pretty negligible, pretty trivial.
So really, for the most part, we're just using JavaScript in any context, just for the front-end development. We would never really do anything more complex or anything that's too crazy. Just seems like there's better systems for everything. Like, what's the real strength to JavaScript in anything besides having to use it for browsers and stuff like that?
Seems like JavaScript would be really buggy or prone to bugs.
Like, I mean, have you ever used a website before? They're full of bugs.
Yeah. But you said Python can do like the same stuff, can't it? I mean, what's the reason that JavaScript is still utilized on the front end versus another program that might be able to do the same thing?
I mean,
or can they not?
Well, so right now, JavaScript is the only language that will run in a browser. So you have to use JavaScript to build an interactive website. A lot of people really hate that. And like, trying to think how to describe the culture here. Like, there are a lot of people who just quit front-end development and they decide to only be back-end developers until like JavaScript is less terrible or they have another option. I know in the C# community, there's like some initiative to try to get C# to work on the front end, but I think that's like years away from being like an actual usable technology. The point is that a lot of people like don't like JavaScript and are looking for some way to do anything else instead of JavaScript, but we're stuck with it for now, unfortunately. So like that is kind of a good intuition. Like if you could use Python on the front end instead, a lot of people would probably prefer to do that, but unfortunately you can't. Now, me personally, I don't think JavaScript is too bad. Like I build applications front and back end with JavaScript. I think Node.js is a fine server-side language, but that is not what we're doing here. Specifically, there's a much better job market for Django Python developers. So we're trying to give you the most like relevant, most lucrative skills. Cool, so that's 44. I just want to double check here real quick. The order of these does not matter. Yeah, okay. Okay, so let me think.
What is the keyboard shortcut you're using to comment that out without like typing?
In VS Code, it's Command/.
Nice.
Yeah, you can also like highlight selections and
That's super useful, actually. That's cool.
yeah, I love it. Okay, so I have a little bit more to talk about with strings, but we're going to get to that later after we've covered functions and kind of circle back. So for now, though, I think we're about ready to take a break. Does anyone have any questions about strings before we take a break? Francisco, actually, I think you had your hand up a while ago and then never got to you.
Yeah, I ended up getting the answer from one of the other students, or you went over it. That's why I put it back down. Thank you, though.
Okay, cool. Glad. Did anyone else have a question? Terrence.
Yeah, this might be slightly off topic, but do you know why it's called JavaScript? Because I hear it has nothing to do with Java at all.
What it has to do with Java was that Java was a popular programming language and JavaScript wanted to be a popular programming language. So it was named after it. It was like purely for marketing. Just Java was the language everyone was talking about at the time, and people wanted JavaScript to be taken seriously. So they just pretended like, yeah, it's basically just like Java, but simpler. So it's like scripting, you know, but it's basically Java. You already know Java, you'll love JavaScript. Check it out. Which was not true, but I think it was, you know, good marketing hype, and it got people to learn it and pay attention to it. But yeah, the common joke people say is that Java is to JavaScript as car is to carpet. Like it has the same root word, but they're completely unrelated. Was there another question? Two hands up, just shout it out.
Yeah, I got a question about strings. And if you, so like with the 99 bottles, I was, instead of like typing a bunch of console logs, I had \ns in there for new lines and one long string, you know, going all the way across on one line. Is there a way to format it so that it looks like, you know, so you could have the one long string on several lines without like introducing return characters or anything like that?
Right, so like what we did here, you don't like that because it's got all of them.
Right.
Yeah,
without using the backtick. Without using the backticks. It was like for the last part where you're like down to one bottle and it just has that big thing of text. You could just, you know, copy and paste into there, and it doesn't have any variables. So you could just put, but it was like 4 or 5 lines.
There's not a great way to do that. I would recommend just like using word wrap in your editor. So yeah, I think it's, what is it, Alt-Z? Yeah. So Option-Z or Alt-Z or whatever in VS Code toggles word wrap. So you can see here now my line 24 is 3 lines long. It doesn't actually change what's in your code. So it doesn't really give you anything to commit, but it's one option you have to make it more readable.
Okay, I was just thinking for like, you know, if you're working on a project, other people are going to have to, you know, come in and read your code. And then if they're not using VS Code, for example, then it's just going to be all one line for them, right?
Right. Although any editor should have like a word wrap capability.
Okay. Well, thanks.
Yep.
And for me, just to understand this better. So like HTML, CSS, the interaction between that's kind of like it works with Java. Like, why do you need JavaScript and HTML for the same purpose of running the front end of a website or anything like that? Like, I get HTML is more like the visuals, right? Like for the actual like setup and the visual part of it.
Mhm.
Is that like, does that have to be a separate file, or is there any way it can be incorporated into like JavaScript or something like that to interact more closely? How does that work in Union?
So things get a little bit muddled. Traditionally, all of the content is in your HTML, and then the CSS just determines how the content looks, colors and sizes and positioning. And then the JavaScript adds interactivity. It says like, if the user clicks on this, or they type in over here, they submit this form, then send this data somewhere else, or change this text on the screen, or whatever. So the JavaScript is just handling interactivity, changing things. It applies logic, does loops and whatever. But more commonly, well, not commonly, more modernly, I guess, and what we're going to be doing later on in this course is we're going to have the JavaScript also generate the HTML. So you'll see JavaScript kind of like takes over the entire front end, and it ends up doing the jobs of other technologies. Like, so when we get to React, you're going to find that your HTML file is very, very small. You're going to have one HTML file for your whole project, and there's almost nothing in it, because pretty much all of the content is going to be described in the JavaScript. So there are different ways that you can build front-end web applications, but traditionally, the JavaScript is just for like changing the HTML in response to the user's actions. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps a lot. I was just trying to like see why all three are needed at the same time. Maybe one can like replace it, but that's a good example of how they kind of function together. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I think they all have their own purpose, and HTML is good at what it's good at. CSS is good at what it's good at. There are some web developers out there who just honestly never learn HTML and never learn CSS. They say it's like not real programming, which it's true, it's not, but it's still important and you should learn it. And so these people will just try to do everything in JavaScript because that's the only thing they know. And I think that's a big part of what's wrong with the modern web, honestly. But that's a bit of a soapbox. For now, though, do you have any more questions before we take a break? No more questions? Okay, so let's take a quick 10-minute break. It's 10:05, so come back at 10:15, and we're gonna briefly cover the other primitive types before we start talking about arrays. All right. Did anyone think of any questions while we were out on break? Any questions? No? Okay, let's continue then. Oh, Francisco?
Yeah, so this might be kind of weird and fetching, but is it possible for us to do, at the same time we're doing interpolation, to run an operator between two variables within this interpolation?
Yes. I'm trying to think of why you would want to do that.
Right, that's why I said it was kind of just fetching.
I did that for one of my solutions yesterday. I used the ternary operator to figure out the value was greater than 1 to output bottles versus bottle.
Oh yeah, ternary operator makes sense. I was trying to think of a simpler example. I don't know.
Could you just throw in like a +1, for instance, at greeting inside there? Or in place, wherever, it doesn't matter. But in any of those, can you just throw it in there?
Yeah, so any JavaScript expression you can put in here. So any JavaScript code that can be boiled down to a single value, you can put inside of those curly braces. There's too many logs here. Let's get that out.
you could put you could assign a variable that's that you change the string to, kind of like with the def grandma thing. Having the message inside a prompt, changing what string is associated with message. You can decide where, what a string gets inserted, and you can just have a variable that's changing based on loops and such too. So there's
works.
ways to play with it.
A lot of options.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Yep. All right, so I know I said we were gonna talk about arrays, but actually first I want to talk about variable declaration a little bit. So it's going to be a brief aside from our talk about types here. Since we just came back from a break, I think it's a fine time to switch gears a little bit. So generally speaking, in JavaScript, there are 3 ways that you can declare a variable. Historically, the only option you had was using var. Let's see. So var is kind of like the loosest, least strict way that you can define a variable. You can like define a variable that already exists, I believe, or reassign an existing variable. It like doesn't really care. You can, in some cases, access variables before they've even been defined. These things will get, they call it hoisting. When you declare a variable at the bottom of the page, it might actually be accessible at the top. So var actually behaves in some kind of weird ways. And for a variety of reasons, I'm going to discourage you from using it ever. I know I used it a little bit earlier in this lecture just because I hadn't mentioned these other techniques yet, but that's probably the last time you're going to see me using var in this course. So more modern JavaScript prefers to either use const, this lets you create a variable that you cannot reassign. And the other way is let. So for just a really quick example of the difference between those. So this is going to throw an error. I cannot reassign a variable that has been declared using const. It's going to give me an error. Assignment to constant variable is a type error on main.js line 39. So that's right over here. What I can do is define the variable with let, and then I can reassign it, no problem. So that's no problem. So that's kind of big difference between these 3. var, just never use it. You can just forget this exists in the language. Const, this is what you should be using for the most part, because most of your variables should never be reassigned. In general, if you avoid reassigning variables and you just create new variables instead, your code is going to be easier to read. But if there is a specific situation where you do need to reassign a variable, or you think it would make other parts of your code much simpler if you reassigned a variable, then you can use let. But at least then, because you use let, that communicates to readers of your code that, hey, this variable is kind of get reassigned. So, watch it a little bit more closely. Whereas if you see a variable is defined with const, that makes the code easier to read because, I can see it defined at the top of the page and I can skim down to the bottom of the page and see that variable again and trust that it hasn't been reassigned somewhere in the middle because const variables cannot be reassigned. Whereas with a let variable, if I see it's assigned at the top of the page and then it's referenced at the bottom of the page, I might be wondering like, well, is this variable being reassigned anywhere in the middle? Is it still referring to the thing that I think it's referring to? So there's more questions you have to ask with let. Const is just kind of simpler. Dalton?
Would you say it's good practice to only, maybe not only, but essentially most of the time, only use let, like if you're declaring it inside of a loop, since oftentimes if it's in a loop, you're probably going to need to change it with every iteration?
So that's kind of funny. You can actually use const in a for loop. Let me just show you that. I know this might seem kind of unintuitive. So here I'm doing a for loop, just counting up to 10. Oh, what?
You made your iterator that constant.
No, there's some slightly different context I'm thinking of. I think. We might come back to this in a couple of weeks. There's definitely some situation in JavaScript looping. What should I call it? Where it doesn't seem like you should be able to use const, but it does work because of like when the variables get declared. Whatever. This is getting into the weeds. You don't need to worry about it. So yeah, use let for loops. You're reassigning the variable in the loop. That totally makes sense. That is what readers would expect.
Nice.
Although I do appreciate the weird questions, even if it takes me to strange corners of JavaScript that I'm less familiar with. I think it's great to explore the programming language and just ask dumb questions like this. I mean, weird questions. None of your questions are dumb. I'm sorry. Somebody else raised their hand, I think. Justin?
Dalton first.
I already went. I just didn't take it
Oh,
down.
okay, my bad.
Oh.
So what was my question? Oh, the different, you said we don't have to use variable. You actually said that you don't suggest we use it ever.
Correct.
Correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is the difference between using a var and a let within a function, for example. If I declare a variable, it seems to work everywhere within the function, even inside of embedded loops. But if I make like a function and then I have a for loop and I declare a let inside that for loop, it doesn't exist outside of that for loop. But if I create a variable inside that for loop, it also exists outside the for loop, but within the function. So it's kind of a scoping thing. Is there a, it seems like they have different scopes. So I guess that being said, is there a kind of a rule of thumb or kind of a standard way that people kind of go about? Is it a kind of a general consensus that nobody really uses var because it's wonky for some reason?
Right. So what you just described is another reason why people don't like using var, is that the variables defined with var are sometimes accessible in more places than you might expect, whereas let is going to be more limited in scope, and that's what you want.
Okay. All right.
Cool. All right, so moving on to some other types.
Skylar had a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, we have a question?
Oh, yeah, I mostly come from Java. So it's like, I can't access variables outside. It's like context, which is like the brackets. So if I declared a variable inside the for loop, I would not be able to access it outside of that loop. Or same concept, if I made a variable inside of a function, I cannot access that variable outside that function. So you're saying that a var can be defined in a loop inside of a function and then called somewhere else?
So with var, a var that is declared inside of a function can be accessed anywhere else inside of that function, regardless of being inside of or outside of other loops. It just matters if it's inside of the function. So that kind of defies people's expectations, I think.
Oh, okay, I can see how that could be messy then.
Yeah.
Kind of like a global function variable, so to speak. Not,
It's
I don't want to confuse you, never mind.
yeah, not
No,
quite
that-
global, but it expands
say
out
global,
the
yeah.
function scope.
Within the scope of the function, right?
All right, so let's talk briefly about arrays. So an array is basically just a list of values, but those values can be anything. So like strings, numbers, objects, or wait, oh no, I'm sorry. Forgot our other primitive types. These are really simple, so this will just take a minute to go over. Did I forget Booleans? These are really simple. There's true or false. There's only two possible Boolean values. That's all it is. They're really just used for logical statements, just saying, you know, if this, then that, whatever. They have logical operators that you can operate on them with. Such as and or. And also not, which is a unary operator. So unary meaning it takes one operand. You can just add this not operator to anything, and it gives you the opposite of that thing. So let's say if so you can use the double ampersands to combine multiple logical conditions, and then this code only runs if all of them are true. This is false. Then, you know, it doesn't run. You can chain any number of logical statements together. And they need to all be true. There's even one false in this chain of logical statements, then the whole thing is false and it won't log. And then on the flip side, using the double pipes is for or. And then if you have a chained or operation, having even one truthy value in there somewhere makes the whole thing true. I saw a hand up just now.
So I don't necessarily imagine you would need to do this, but just so I can kind of, so if you had, say you had true and false and true or whatever, you just had 3 trues, but you put and then you put like an or statement, is that or statement only gonna go off of like the one that's next to it, if you know what I'm kind of asking?
Yeah, so you have to know like what order everything gets evaluated in. So I think it's like left to right. So first we look at false or true. So that evaluates to true. And then it evaluates this true or false. So that evaluates to true. And then it evaluates true or true, which should be true. But if you're not sure, just add parentheses. And then the things in parentheses always get evaluated first. Actually, speaking of which, so I probably should have mentioned this back when we were talking about numbers, but do people remember Pemdas, the order of operations?
Yeah. Pemdas. Parentheses, exponent, multiply, divide, add, subtract.
Okay, so that applies to programming also. But in my opinion, it's not really important that you memorize these operations, memorize the specific order of them. Just if you're doing a lot of math and it's not immediately obvious what the correct order to apply the operations is, just put parentheses around things that should be done first. Like maybe it's not even mathematically necessary to add the parentheses, but it makes your code a lot easier to read. And that's very important.
So in that case, if you were doing what I just said, you would want to put the parentheses around the or statement. So you know the system will do the or statement for first, and then it can move into all the and statements.
Yeah. That's probably what I would do. And then so just a quick demonstration of the unary operator. So console log true, great, that's true. Console log not true, that's false. Not true, that's true again. So you can just keep negating things over and over and it just flips it back and forth, which is actually not completely useless. There are some cases where you want to do this. So I've shown you before that when you try to apply like the wrong operand to a value, that JavaScript will try to convert it. So if I try to console.log not 4, so 4 is not a Boolean value, but it's going to try to convert it into a Boolean value. In this case, it gets converted to true. Any non-zero number is technically a truthy number, and 0 is a falsy number. So not 4 is going to get converted to false. And then not 4 would be true. So this is something that people do sometimes to convert a value into a Boolean. It's kind of a bit of JavaScript shorthand that you might see occasionally. All right, that's about all I've got to say about Booleans. Not super complicated. So next up is null. Let's talk about this here. So null has no value, basically. That's really all it is. Whenever you want to specifically say like there's nothing here, you can just set it to null. So like, I don't know, let's say I said my hat equals sombrero, because that's what I'm wearing at some point. Great. But then maybe in the future, I take off my hat. I no longer have one. Maybe I want to reassign that. My hat equals null. So that's kind of one way that you could represent that in code. Jacob?
Yeah, I was trying to use the null for the def grammar, like whenever there wasn't any like response to the prompt. I said it like if response equals null, then say what. That didn't seem to work, but it worked with just an empty string. Could you just tell me why like null wouldn't work for that?
So when you were trying to compare them, did you use double equals or triple equals?
I believe I used triple.
Okay. So So let's take this opportunity to talk about comparisons in JavaScript. So yeah, basically there are two different ways that you can compare values in JavaScript to see if they're the same. This is yet another one of the features that a lot of people hate about JavaScript. People consider this to be a mistake of the language. Is that, so I'll say the way that you should be making comparisons is using triple equals. Let's say like, console.log 4 equals 4. This is only true if there's the exact same value on both sides of that triple equal sign, which is true in this case. But if we say something like 4 equals 4, then this is no longer going to be true because this 4 is a number and this 4 is a string. So since they're different types, there's no way that they could be the same. However, there is another option in JavaScript. So another option is using the double equal sign, which I will encourage you to never use. And what this does is first JavaScript is going to say like, are these things the same value? And if not, it's going to take a second step and say like, okay, but what if we converted them to the same type? Then would they be the same value? And so in that case, JavaScript's going to say like, well, we can convert this number 4 into a string 4 and then try to compare them. And so that's going to say it's true. And so there are a lot of situations where values will get converted to Booleans. So let's say, pretty sure this should work. Okay, so the double equals isn't going to convert them like that. I'm sorry, can you repeat what it was that you actually did that didn't work?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So whenever like I had a prompt, it was like, say hi to grandma or something. And then if I didn't type anything at all and just hit enter, then the program would exit. But if I had it set to just an empty string or just like quotes that are right next to each other, it would work. So I was just thinking like if I wouldn't put anything at all, then the program would think that it was like null or undefined.
Okay. So that's a slightly different issue. That's not about null or undefined. The issue is that prompt, the JavaScript window.prompt, this always returns a string. Just no matter what the user types in, always gives you back a string. And if the user typed in nothing, you get an empty string. It's a string with 0 characters in it, but it's still a string.
Okay, so that's definitely not null or undefined. It's just an empty string.
So your logic was comparing that empty string equals empty string, basically.
Sorry, one thing.
Yeah, that's the one that's the way it worked for me.
I had the same problem, and it turns out that the prompt has a cancel button also. So if you press the cancel button, it gives you null.
Okay.
Interesting. All right, so let's move on though.
I have a question regarding your the issue with the double equals.
Yep.
If I have a you know, a web-based search field, right? And the user's inputting a value to provide to me, and then I'm comparing that value to numbered in, you know, number indexes in my database or something like that. I would want to compare my number 4 to the string 4 that I got from the text prompt that I asked them to give me, right? In which
Right.
case, using a double equals might be a good thing, because otherwise I'm converting my number 4 to a string 4 to compare it anyway.
Right.
Are there circumstances where that's okay, or?
So I mean, that would be the circumstance, like, and I think
Yeah.
that that's why JavaScript works this way, is because of handling user input and wanting to compare it to numbers easily.
Sure.
But in my opinion, it's just kind of sloppy. I think like you should be more explicit about what you're doing. Just, they say like explicit is better than implicit,
Sure.
instead of relying on the automatic behaviors of your language and trusting that readers, you know, understand all the automatic behaviors of JavaScript. Maybe you should like type your code out so it specifically does what it says it does.
Okay, so erring on the side of being explicit before you have to move into some implicit function to handle a circumstance. That makes sense.
Yeah. Because I mean, like, I love JavaScript and I know all of its weird quirks and automatic behaviors, but some people, you know, are primarily Python developers. Maybe they just have to write a little bit of JavaScript, like, you know, occasionally one day a week. And so they would probably rather not get deep into all the quirks of JavaScript and see it written in a more conventional way instead. Was there another hand up?
Is JavaScript like the only language that has a strict comparison and a loose comparison? Did you say?
It's not actually. PHP has a similar kind of deal going on with actually different rules about how types get converted. I used to write a bunch of PHP. So for as messy as JavaScript is, I think PHP is even worse. Not that it's like terrible, you can make money writing it, but it's definitely not like an organized and orderly language the way like Python or like C++ would be. All right, moving on. Let's talk a little bit about arrays. And by arrays, I mean undefined. That's the last primitive type to talk about before we get to arrays. So undefined also has no value. It's very similar to null. It's not really obvious what the difference is at first glance. I can show you this at least. So for whatever reason, null double equals undefined, that's true. It'll convert one of them into the other. But null triple equals undefined, that's still false, because these are technically different values. These are technically different types. Although undefined is the only value of type undefined, and null is the only value of type null. This is also kind of a weird quirk of JavaScript. Most programming languages don't have two different values that mean nothing. There's just like one null type generally. But I do think this is useful in JavaScript. So the reason why I think this is useful is because you'll encounter these values for different reasons. So sometimes JavaScript will create an undefined value when it needs to give you something and there's nothing else to give you. So like when you call a function that doesn't have a return statement in it, well, the function has to return something. So that something that it returns is going to be undefined. Or if you try to access an element in an array that doesn't exist, JavaScript's not going to throw an error. It's just going to give you undefined. pretty much any other programming language would throw an error in that case instead of just giving you this undefined value. But excuse me, JavaScript tries to avoid throwing errors as much as possible. So it gives you this value undefined. Whereas null is never produced automatically. Null only appears because some human decided that the value of this thing should be null in this case.
So it's undefined unless it becomes null, unless someone makes it null.
I'm not sure if I would phrase it like that. I would say every function has an undefined return value unless you explicitly return something, and that something could be null. But there isn't really a specific relationship between null and undefined, except that we kind of interpret them to mean the same thing. Just that there's no value there. I just think it's useful understanding how these can be produced, where they might come from. All right, so these are our primitive types: strings, numbers, Boolean, null, and undefined. We're going to learn about some non-primitive types, starting with arrays. Array is just a simple list of values. And more specifically, it is an ordered list of values. So there's a first item, there's a last item. Pretty sure you've seen these before. So this is how I define a literal array. We'll refer to arrays in a lot of ways, but this is the simplest, most straightforward way to define an array. If I want, I can console log the whole thing. There's my array, great. I can also console log specific elements of this array. Justin, do you have a question?
Nope, sorry.
So can anyone tell me, how do I log a specific element of this array? This should be review. Let's say I wanted to see Thursday.
You would do a bracket and index 0 is the first one. So you would just go over 0, 1, 2, 3. So it'd be days of week bracket 3. Yep. Perfect.
Yep. We start counting at 0 when we are computer scientists. So Thursday should be the third item. Terrence, did you have your hand up?
We're learning how to raise our hands.
No, I was just testing something.
Cool. So like I was saying before, arrays, store other variables. So each index of this array is essentially a reference to some other value. They're almost like variables in themselves. So I can actually assign to it if I want. Days of the week 3 equals Saturday. And then we'll console log the days of the week again. And then we can see that the second time we log it, it has changed. We've replaced Thursday with Saturday. So they're useful for storing lists of things. In theory, they can have different types. These are all strings, but they could be numbers, objects, Booleans, or whatever. But generally, arrays are most useful when they have the same type of thing in them. So that way you can do a loop over the array and do the same processing to every item of the array, because they're all the same. All right, so arrays, probably one of your most basic data types. Another very important data type is an object. In JavaScript, they say everything is an object. So you're going to be using these a lot. So critical differences between an object and an array is that, for one thing, the object is not ordered. It doesn't have a first item or a last item. It's just a bag of stuff. And instead of being individual values, they are key value pairs. So each value has kind of like a key, is what they're called, that you can use to look it up, like an ID number, sort of. But the keys and objects are strings. So whereas an array is usually used to represent a list of items, an object is usually used to represent a single item that has a lot of details to it. So for example, say user is, and then square braces or curly braces are how we create an object literal. All right, so here we've got an object literal. A couple of things I want to point out is that keys are strings, but you don't need quotation marks. Just because the keys of a JavaScript object are always strings, it's just assumed it's a string. Like, there's no way that this is a variable. Even if I had something like let name equals Bob, it doesn't matter. Like, this name variable has nothing to do with this name key. They're completely unrelated. This is not a variable name here on line 82. This is a string name, which is serving as the key for our object. It's just as a convenience to us as developers, we don't have to write the quotation marks around them. You can if you want to. This is also perfectly valid JavaScript. And in fact, when we get to Python, this is how you'll have to write dictionaries, is what they're called in Python. But in JavaScript, we get to kind of skip a step. You don't have to put the quotation marks on the keys. It's just assumed that they are strings. Dalton?
Now, if you wanted to have multiple users in that, you would essentially create an array for each user, correct?
I would create an object for each user and then fill an array with multiple objects. So
Yeah, okay, yeah, that makes sense. That's what I kind of meant.
So that's one way. I can just fill my array with references to objects. I could also just put a literal object in here. And lastly, you do not need a comma after the last item in an object or even in an array. But when you put them on multiple lines like this, I would recommend that you do actually write it here, even though it's not necessary. Makes your code a little bit easier to maintain over time. All right. Now, who can tell me, how do we access a property from this object? So let's say I want to get Alice's name.
Bracket notation or period notation.
Mm-hmm. What's the difference?
So if you use dot notation, you can't use a variable. It essentially has to be that actual name. But if you use bracket notation, you can either put a variable in there or put a string with the actual name.
Yeah, so using the dot notation like this is less flexible, but it's more convenient. So if this does the job for you, then I would encourage you to use dot notation because I think it's easier to read, it's easier to write. But sometimes that's not going to work for you. So let's say I don't actually know upfront which property I want to read. I'm not sure if I want the name or the age. So let's say now if I console.log alice.property, so this does nothing. Alice does not have a property called property. Let's actually see what that does. So that's undefined. I tried to log a property that doesn't exist. Python would throw an error. JavaScript is just going to say it's undefined. So in this case, we could use bracket notation. So this is the straightforward way with brackets and then a string for, brackets and then the string of the property I'm looking for. So Alice has an age property, so that's going to log it for me. But if I don't know up front, excuse me, what property I want to log, I can just pass a variable in here. And you can only do this with bracket notation. So now Alice at property, which is how we say this. So this lets me dynamically look up whichever property was assigned to this variable. Could be age, could be name. Let's make this a little more interesting. Say,
Show some spaces.
so we're going to generate a random number. And then I'm going to do a little bit of logic here. We're going to say if the number is greater than 0.5, the property is going to be name. If it's less than 0.5, it's going to be age. But just to give you a little bonus here, I'm going to also use a ternary operator, which I know some people mentioned before, and I'm supposed to cover at some point in this lecture, I think. So I'm going to show it to you now. So let property equals random number greater than 0.5, and then question mark. And we're going to say, so we're saying let property equals, we're trying to assign something to property, but what are we going to assign to it? So we start off with this logical statement here before the question mark, random number greater than 0.5. And then if that's true, the value of property is going to be age, the left side of the colon. If this value is false, then the value of property will be name, the right side of the colon. So does anyone know why this is called a ternary operator?
Because it has 3 operands.
Yes, thank you. I'm so happy. Oh my gosh. So I showed you earlier the binary operators. That's most of them. They take 2 operands. There's also a unary operator. Well, there's a few of them, but the not is a unary operator. It takes one operand. This question mark here, along with the colon, I guess, this is called the ternary operator because it's the only operator in JavaScript that takes 3 operands. Needs a logical statement that can be true or false, and then it needs an option when it's true and an option when it's false. So this is a more concise way of doing if-else logic. If you have to do something really simple in one line, it might be useful, but I would discourage you from getting too carried away with this. It's definitely easy to make your code illegible by using ternaries. So like if I see a ternary inside of a ternary, like my eyes just glaze over and I can't read that.
I had added some of my code then, huh?
Yeah, I mean, if like you were working for me on a team, I might ask you to refactor it. I mean, it's cool, like as we're all students, just learning how to get the code to work and knowing you can put ternaries inside of ternaries. But like practically speaking, if there's an easier way for you to write that, that's not so hard on my eyes, I would prefer that. I don't know, I think I have like poor eyesight or something. I just put lots of new lines and like lots of white space in my code to make it easier to read. I have a hard time reading other people's code sometimes when it's like super, super dense or with tiny fonts.
Is that considered best practice, or is that a personal thing, or does it differ like among companies?
Like not using nested ternaries.
Right.
I don't think I've heard people say it specifically like that, but in general, people don't like it when ternary statements get too complicated. And if there's like too much logic in one line of code, you should break it up so it's easier to follow.
Okay. I see it a lot on Code Wars, and I think, I think just using Code Wars too much, we might start to like not have best practices, because I think they're just trying to make it simpler or something.
Right. The thing is that like the solutions you create for Code Wars are written once and read never, So it just has to like check the boxes and pass the tests or whatever. Whereas code that you'll write professionally is, you write it once, refactor it, maintain it over time, and you have to read it and reread it many, many times. Like especially as new people join the team, they need to understand how the app works. It's very important that people can read your code and understand very quickly what it does. There's really no value in being clever, in my opinion, with your code. It's much better that it's stupid and obvious and people can understand at first glance what it does.
All right, that makes me happy because it was really hard to read their code when I saw it. So, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like to say sometimes that programming is kind of like the opposite of math, because in math, it's like the truth of the world is very simple. It's like x = 5, but it's presented to you in a very complicated way, and you have to just untangle the formula to figure out what the simple truth is. Whereas in programming, the truth is very complicated, and it's our job to describe it in the simplest way we possibly can using code.
Yeah, my lady doesn't like it when I go shopping because she'll use if and then, and I don't bring anything back.
I've heard that joke before. Okay, so we covered arrays, covered objects a little bit, but we definitely had to skip a lot of exciting stuff because we hadn't covered functions yet. So that's what we're going to do now. This is where programming gets fun. And then we're going to kind of see how functions relate to the other types that we talked about previously. Does anyone have any questions though about arrays, objects, these types that we've covered so far before we move on and talk about functions a little bit?
Does all of this apply the same way to the values as it does to the keys?
How do you mean?
Like when you're trying to recall like dot notation and etc.
I'm not sure if I follow you. Can you elaborate on your question?
Let me think about what I'm actually trying to ask for a second.
All right. Let me know when you think about it and we'll get back to you. Dalton?
So this is actually about functions before you start. So in C# you can have a function that just returns a void because it's just kind of doing something. Is that possible in JavaScript?
I mean, you can have a function that returns null. You can have a function that returns undefined. And if you don't tell it to return anything, it returns undefined anyway.
And that wouldn't like break your app or whatever? I don't know if it would ever be useful, but
Yeah, sure, it could be useful. Sometimes, so usually the reason why you call a function is because you want it to return something. But sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes a function just has side effects, like maybe it sends an email or something. You don't need to get a return value out of it. And so in that case, like you don't have to return anything from the function. And so were you saying C# or Java was your comparison?
so yes, because in C# you can do that. You can just have it return. You just put void and then it, because you have to define what that function's supposed to give you. So you can just say it's void and it won't give you anything. So I was just wondering if you could do that in JavaScript.
Right. So that would be kind of like explicitly returning null from your function, I guess. But that's not really necessary because JavaScript doesn't demand that you have a return type. Whereas, in C#, like you probably didn't want to return anything from your function, but it needs to return something. So you say null to kind of indicate that it's not important.
Cool. That makes sense. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so functions. Oh, Justin, you got a question?
Yeah, this is kind of a large spanning question, I guess. What was it? In the coding that I've been doing so far and learning and doing the challenges and such like that, usually it involved either one larger function, and I might even have to make smaller functions within that function. When it comes to kind of industry practices, is it when you have to make a new function, like if I have to make a function that does something specific, is it better to make that in its own text file so that it's more modular? Are we going to have, I guess, later in the weeks, some conversation about kind of best practices in terms of how to structure your code within your file structure to kind of follow these best practices instead of writing all your stuff in the same text file? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit about importing and exporting data in and out of different files. We're actually going to touch on that for like 10 seconds at the end of today.
Oh, okay.
But it's more when we get to building applications. So with Django and React, that's when you really need to start separating things out into different files. And so we'll talk more about project structure then. But generally speaking, I would say like you should just put functions where they're needed. If you have a function that is only used in one particular file, it's fine to just define it in that file. But if you have a function that's used in a few different files, like you should define it in some external location that's accessible to all the places where it's needed.
Okay. All right. So we'll cross the bridge when we come to it, I guess. Thanks.
Yep. There isn't really like one right solution. It's basically just about being practical with what you've got, what you need to organize. Okay, so functions, reusable set of logic, returns value. So let's give an example of a function here real quick. So this is a function. Skylar?
So in this function, we would make that a constant since we're not changing it. I'm sorry if that's at a line there or whatever, but in that instance, we would, right?
Yeah, it would be better. In general, I'd say that you should always use const unless you need to use let. You will probably see me using let during demos purely out of laziness. It's usually not too consequential either way, but like if anyone asks you what's the best practice for variable declaration, like that's something that you might be asked in an interview. The correct answer they're looking for is that you should prefer const. All right, so let's look at this function here. What is going to happen when I run my code?
It's going to return first and last in a string.
Is it?
Well, I mean, it's not going to run anything actually because you're not calling full name.
Yeah, you gotta, oh, something else is wrong here. What's going on? Properties random number. All right, because I commented that out. Yeah, so this is a super common newbie mistake. I shouldn't say newbie because I feel like I've done this within the past year. Experienced people do this sometimes too. But defining a function and then you run your code and you're like, why is it not doing anything? It's because you need to call your function. So this here, defining a function, this is basically just like writing a script, sort of some like process, some set of actions to be performed, but it doesn't actually perform that set of actions. So we need to call our function. To do so, we put the function name with parentheses. The parentheses are what calls it. Otherwise, we're just referring to the function. And then we have to pass in values for the parameters. So when we define it, we say these are parameters. But when we call the function, the values we pass in, we call those arguments. All right, so what is Dan's full, what? Oh, so we're returning it, but we're not actually like viewing it in any way. So I need to console.log. Cool. So that concatenates the two names together, assigns it to a variable, returns it. This is actually a little bit verbose. Can do this in one line. So yeah, the variable assignment wasn't even necessary. So we'll just do this all at once. Dalton?
If you did it the other way though, couldn't you also console log the variable and then return it? And then if you just called the function, it would do it by itself, or would you still need to console log it?
So that's a good point. In this case, like this totally works, but let's say it didn't, and I wanted to know why. Like it's not easy to investigate because so much logic is happening on this one line. So if I was going to debug it, the first thing that I would do actually is rewrite it to look like this. So that way I can console log answer. So this is actually like one of my bigger frustrations with working with other developers is that you will find a lot of people that will try to put as much logic as possible on one line. Like if they could do it in one line, then they will, and they think that they're better programmers because they've made things more concise. But inevitably, like there's a bug in it somewhere, And then in order for me to figure out like what went wrong, like at what step in this process did we mess up, I have to refactor it and break it down into multiple steps like this. So sometimes like for very trivial logic, you'll put things onto one line to make it easier to read. But sometimes it doesn't actually make it easier to read, and it definitely makes it harder to debug.
Thanks.
Yep. All right, so there's also a few different ways to define functions in JavaScript. What I showed you here, kind of, excuse me, it's function name. This is sort of the older style. What's slightly newer is assigning the function to a variable. So like const So this is a slightly more modern way to define functions. I would generally recommend you not define your functions like this. This is a little bit weirder and gets some JavaScript quirks involved. There's just some kind of funny behavior about where these functions are accessible when you define them like this. So a little more commonly is you're just going to use a regular variable like const, most likely, for defining your function like so. And then even more recently, this is called ES6, ECMAScript 6. There's a new way to define functions called arrow functions. So arrow functions do actually work differently than these traditional functions. The distinction between them is not something I'm going to get into right now. That kind of relates to object-oriented programming. So we're going to get into that in a week or two. But generally speaking, arrow functions are simpler than functions defined using the function keyword. They just do less. They have fewer automatic behaviors associated with them. So they're generally simpler, and you should generally prefer them unless there's a reason why they won't work for you. Nathan?
I remember during the pre-work, I was trying to do something with functions and I thought they behaved the same. So I was trying to use a fat arrow one, but it just totally like messed up the whole behavior and I couldn't get it to work no matter what I did. And then going back to just the normal function it did. So when should you just, wouldn't you want to go for the more broad ranging one rather than the more niche one? Because it could just mess something up in your code that you would assume would work the same way.
I'm not sure if I'm following you. I might have to take a look at your code, but I wouldn't.
Pre-work problem I did before. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I was trying to do something with the fat arrow function and it would not read inside of like another function or something weird like that. And when I just put function, then it all worked perfectly fine, like the normal way to define it.
So I'm not exactly sure what's happening in your case, but
Yeah.
one of the issues has to do with hoisting. So when you define functions like this, they're actually accessible before they are defined. So let's see if I can do this. let's get that. Okay, so this should look pretty bizarre to you. On line 101, I am calling my function full name, and then line 102, I'm defining it. That is not how you should expect code to work. Things are supposed to be defined from top to bottom, like code runs line by line, top to bottom. So this should look really wrong to you. This is another one of the reasons why people don't like JavaScript, and why I'm discouraging you from defining your functions like this, because it makes them available in places where you wouldn't expect them to be. In contrast with this, this function doesn't have a value until the line below it runs. So that's going to give me an error. Cannot access it before initialization. So this is much saner. This is generally how people expect programming languages to work. So that's why I am recommending you define your functions like this instead. We just had a hand up.
Yeah, is hoisting ever practical or even used in the work environment?
I would like to forget it exists in the language. I think you should never write your code such that it depends on hoisting. Like at best, it'll work and just be really surprising to other people who are less familiar with JavaScript. Because again, a lot of the people who write JavaScript don't do it as their primary language, and they would really rather not be doing it at all. We got a couple other hands up.
I think I remember for, what is it, the prototype methods or whatever, like the built-in methods for functions in general, are they any different between the fat arrow and when you call the normal function? Are they the same types of prototypes?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
So is it better practice to write a new function into your code as you need it, or when you need to make a new function, do you put it at the top and put them all together? Or do you just kind of, since we're not relying on hoisting, where do you put your functions? Do you put them in as needed, or would you put them at the top then and declare all your functions first and then write your code below it?
It's hard to say. I can see myself doing either, depending on the situation. I guess it depends on how much the function is used throughout that file. If it's used like all throughout the file, I might define it up at the top. But if it's only used like in one block, I might define it right before that block.
Okay. So I'm understanding correctly that when you define your function with a constant, it eliminates the hoist functionality and it can only be used consecutively within the code?
Right.
Okay.
Did we have another hand up?
Just for my, so when you're doing, I never really used arrow functions. So when you, if you call do something else, would it would work right now as long as you called it on line 118 or after?
Yep.
I guess just 119. And so essentially, if you wanted to add parameters, you would just put it in the parentheses and be like a normal function.
Yep. Yeah, just like a regular function, I can add any number of arguments in between these parentheses here, and then use them inside the function.
Cool.
And excuse me. Oh, right. I need to actually pass something in there.
And I'm assuming it's not like Const where you have to say function because the arrow sign already essentially is saying it's a function.
Right. This, parentheses, fat arrow, braces, this is function.
Cool.
Honestly, I don't like it as much because I like functions that say the word function. Just things that, do what they say they do, I think are nice. But whatever, this is JavaScript. Okay, so
What's the
we
rest of
talked-
that statement that you put in the notes? It's kind of
Pardon?
cut off on the screen. It says unless you. Okay,
So yeah,
thank you.
you shouldn't use this syntax unless you know that's what you need.
Also, why is it giving you an undefined after you put the name in?
Oh,
It was at the time. He didn't have Carol there. So since he didn't put anything, it didn't have anything.
well, it's,
He
I
didn't
think we're
really-
still gonna get it again,
Right.
yeah. So the issue is I'm console logging, do something else, but this function doesn't actually return anything.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
So I should do that. That's better.
Awesome, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so we learned about objects. We learned about functions. So, you know, an object can have any type of value for its properties. So where programming gets really fun is when objects have functions as their properties. Say, so Eve is my object. She has a property, say hello, which I can access with dot notation. Say hello is a function, so I can call it. So this is an important way that we can organize the functionality in our applications, is by grouping functions and data together into objects. And this is really the core of object-oriented programming that we're going to get into in the coming weeks. But right now, what I would like to show you is that in many cases, you don't even need to define these functions on objects, but a lot of built-in types in JavaScript have built-in functions on them already. These are called methods specifically. The function that is attached to an object is called a method. In other programming languages, that word has a slightly more specific meaning, but in JavaScript, it's just a function that is attached to an object. So let's take a look at sorry about this. All right, so I'm going to take a quick trip over to Mozilla Developer Network and look at some built-in string methods. So this is all the functionality that strings have just baked into them already. You don't have to define this. They can already do this stuff. Here we go. Instance methods. So what's interesting? So let's look for includes. This is actually a newer one that was added to JavaScript fairly recently, but I use it pretty commonly. This is a method you can call in a string that tells you if it includes some other string. So let's console.log. Greeting is hello world. So now let's check if greeting dot includes hello. So can we find this string included in this larger string? That is my question here. And I'll need to stop reusing variable names. So that's true. The includes method is able to tell me that it found that substring in a larger string. So there are lots of other ways you might need to interact with, excuse me, strings. Maybe browse through here sometime, see if any of these look normal to you, or I'm sorry, look useful to you. A lot of them kind of do what they say they do. You know, search, replace all. You can kind of use your imagination, figure out what those do. Some of these are a little bit less intuitive. So like slice, maybe you don't know what that does just by the name, but I'll tell you this is an important one. This lets you create a new string that is a subsection of a different string. So let me see how this works. So if I just console.log hello world.slice, say 4. So what it does is it chops off everything after character number 4. If we want to give it 2 arguments, say 4 and 8. So then it only gives me the middle of the string between the 4th character and the 8th character. And then kind of a nice little side effect of this, if you call slice with no arguments, it just copies the string. So
Also, if you don't put an ending, it goes to the very end, right? If you don't put a second variable. So like if it just said slice 4 and parentheses, it would go to the end.
right, that's what we had the first time. So this was slice 4, chopped off the first 4 characters and then got me to the end of it.
Right, okay.
So this is just a nice little JavaScript trick. This is the simplest way to copy a string. You just take a full slice from the beginning to the end, and that's just a copy. And then next I want to talk about arrays. So we're going to transition to that by talking about split. Split is also another really useful string method that converts a string into an array. So I'll say and then in the parentheses, I'll pass in what character I'm going to split the string on. So if I split it on an empty string, that's going to split up every single letter in the string into its own array element. Array. So that gets me every letter as an individual element in the array. This can be really useful a lot of the time, especially for like interview problems, because it's very hard to manipulate strings in JavaScript. You can't like directly assign to a part of a string. Let me show you what I mean real quick here. So, if I console log hello world 3, it tells me it's L 0, 1, 2, 3, great. But if I try to assign to it, this does absolutely nothing. You just cannot assign to individual letters in a string. So what you can do, though, is split the string into an array, and then you can manipulate arrays much more flexibly, and then you can turn it back into a string. So hello array is hello world.split. Look at our hello array. It's this. Say hello array 3 equals Z. And then final equals hello array dot join is the opposite of split. And we're going to join it on an empty string, which means just everything is going to get pushed together into one big string. We'll take a look at that. And it turns our hello world into helzo world, because we were able to manipulate our array and then turn that back into a string. Question?
Yeah, so the constant on the like hello array, you can change it and it still be constant because you're not changing the actual size of the array. If you're changing the size, you would have to use let. Is that the instance there?
I would still be able to use const as long as I wasn't reassigning it to a different array entirely, then const is fine. So let versus const gets a little bit tricky when you're talking about complex types.
So you're saying you'd be able to use const on that variable even if you add another element to that array?
Yeah, I can push extra elements onto here if I want to. So
Wow.
maybe this is a good time to show the push method. So that's an array method that is built in, which let me just show you that real quick. Actually, so just like strings, arrays have many built-in methods that are super useful. Like, I guess join is the one I'll focus on for today. There's others that we'll cover later in the future. Oh, and push. I was going to show you push. So push is how you add items to the end of an array. So after we assign here, we can say hello array.push, put an exclamation mark on the end of it. And then after we join that, we get that exclamation mark at the end. So we manipulate our array and then turn it back into a string. Dalton?
So I don't know if I just missed it. When you declared hello final, you didn't put a let or const. Does that make it constant, or what does that do? I'm just saying, like, if you don't do that, what happens?
It makes it a global variable. It's commonly considered a mistake.
Okay. Cool.
Yep. So yeah, there's definitely way more array methods. Pop is the opposite of push, removes an element from the end of the array. There's definitely a whole bunch of really good ones here. If you want to be good at interviews, knowing the array methods is essential, I would say. Splice is also a good one. This is very commonly confused with slice, and they're different. So you might want to spend a little bit playing around with both of them, or just any of these that look interesting to you. Like really play around with them. Code is fun. There's a lot of stuff you can do. So yeah, I think that's about as much as I have to say about functions for today. As we get to like object-oriented programming later, we're going to dive back into functions again. But this is kind of the basics of it. It's just a way to define some set of repeatable logic. Let's see, before we break today, I think there's just one more thing we need to cover real quick. Looping. Just because, again, there's a few different ways to do this in JavaScript. So I think it's worth mentioning. So we've seen a basic for loop. Let's see. So if I want to print out all these numbers in the loop, there's the basic for loop. So this is just going to get I to count up from 0 to the length of numbers. And then on each iteration, we want to see the value of the numbers array at that index. So that's great. That's the classic way to write a for loop. In modern JavaScript, we've got some new options. So I'm a fan of this guy. So this is a little bit more similar to what you see in a lot of other programming languages, especially Python lets you do loops like this. You can just create a loop variable and do an of loop over that same array. So this should get me the exact same output. It's just a slightly newer, cleaner syntax for the same logic.
Are there any limits to that that you wouldn't get from the for loop?
Yeah, you don't have access to I. So if you need to be like minutely micromanaging the value of I or comparing that number to other numbers, like you can't because you don't have it. But sometimes that's the point. Like sometimes you don't want to be mucking around the weeds with the exact value of I. You just want to do one thing to every item in an array. So this makes that more clear.
So num doesn't act as I. It would be like.
It's the actual value.
It's the actual, yeah, okay.
162,859, not 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, gotcha.
Nathan?
Thanks.
How does that differ with for each element?
They're pretty similar. So here's another array method is for each. So I call for each off of any array, and then I pass in a function for each. So this might look weird the first time you see it, but this is a function inside of for each. I'm not calling this function myself. I'm just passing it in as an argument to for each. And note that this function doesn't even have a name. It's never assigned to a variable, but that's fine. It doesn't need a variable because it's only used once right here. So also, I'm not calling this function myself. For each calls it for me. then when it does call it for me, it's going to call it with each of the numbers from the numbers array as the argument. And I'm going to choose to call that num. So here we can just console log it.
So basically, for each in the let num of nums, is that the same as in the fact that you can't do like break conditions in them like you can in a for loop?
I think you can do break in a let loop, in a for of loop. Let's see if.
Yeah, that worked.
And then the difference between
You're in the output terminal.
Oh my gosh, it's too many tabs. So yeah, numbing 6 break. So you can use break in a for of loop. Honestly, I would like to discourage you from using break. My preference generally for loops is that you should just loop through an entire array from front to back and then do the same processing on every item. If you can't do that for some reason, then like filter out the array, remove items that you shouldn't be processing. So you're just left with an array that you can loop through from front to back. So it just makes your code simpler to read and easier to reason about. As soon as you're doing break and you're like, getting deep into the weeds of your for loop and micromanaging the loop behavior, things get a little bit harder to reason about.
and the difference between for of and for in is that one is for arrays, one is for objects, right? Because that confused me for a little bit. I kept mixing it up and doing the wrong one and stuff like that.
Yes, that is correct. So that actually brings me to my next point of looping through objects. Because the way we do that looks very similar to this. So I'll say, so in the for in loop, we get the value of all of the keys in our object, not the values. So this is going to show me name and age. If I want to get the actual values, can anyone tell me how I do that?
You would have to use bracket notation with the variable. So it would be Mallory bracket key.
Yeah. So yeah, name is Mallory, age is 32. And then, like we were saying before, it's very similar to the for of loop. It looks similar, so don't get them confused. This is not going to work the same way. So for of is only for arrays, cannot use it on objects. For in can work on arrays, but you shouldn't do that. Can anyone guess what would happen if you did a for in loop over an array? So we've got our numbers array up here. If I
It
just
lists the
said,
numbers sequentially. And
well, so it gets us the keys. The numbers are the values. What are the keys?
what else they want to- I was gonna say, when I tried in, because I actually did that initially, instead of giving me the actual numbers that were in there, it was essentially, I guess, giving me the indexes.
Yep. So that's kind of a funny thing about JavaScript arrays and objects. Yeah, so here 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's just giving you the indexes.
Could you do like key dot value?
Sorry, what did you ask?
Could you do like a key dot value? Does it even associate the index with the value? As an object, I guess not, because it's like an object iterator, isn't it? Key and numbers.
Yeah, it's for iterating through objects. And so I can access the values. I want to do this, but
Okay, you can do that. Okay.
you probably shouldn't do this. This looks really goofy to me.
Does it let it happen because arrays are technically an object or whatever for the type?
Yeah, that's why this works. So one of the fun things about JavaScript is that arrays and objects aren't even like totally different types of data. An array is really just a type of object. So like if you see an array like A, B, C, under the hood, that's really an object like so this is what JavaScript is actually doing.
But then how is an array able to sort itself? Because objects you can't sort or anything like that, right? How can you do that to an array?
Because the indices are numbered.
But if I wanted to restructure that array, I could in a different way, just based on, I don't really know.
And
Maybe I just thought they worked differently.
And the way you would restructure this object is just by, I don't know, giving it different keys.
Oh, and it'll just still look for that index in it and then print that out or whatever it's going to be.
More or less.
Okay, that's cool. Thank you.
So for like the way that we just did the loop, Lecky and Mallory.
I'm sorry, say it again.
I said, so for the way that we just did the loop, the Lecky and Mallory, would you do
You're
that?
really quiet. I'm having trouble hearing you.
Would you do that? Or would you do like the object.keys method? Or does it not matter at all?
Object.keys is cool. I don't usually think about it because I would usually just do a for in loop. But object.keys can be useful. That's nice because it gives you an array of the keys, which arrays are just easy to work with. There's a lot of stuff you can do with them. So I can see why people would prefer that.
Okay, but it's just a matter of just choice or style.
Yeah, there are often multiple ways to solve the same problem. It's not always easy to say what's the best.
Okay.
So if you use something like object.keys and it returns that array, if you change something in that array, it doesn't affect the object itself, does it?
Correct, it shouldn't. It's just returning a new array for you. It's not connected to the original data structure.
Can you put a function into an array?
Sure, why not? So yeah, wake up, eat breakfast, go to class, do homework. Is that roughly what you're looking for?
Yeah, thank you.
Cool.
So what would have happened though, if it wasn't all methods? Or like, okay, that was an array though. So what if that was an object of methods?
An object of methods, you're saying?
Yeah. But like, they weren't all methods, right? Like you had just a key that was like age is 5. And then you were trying to iterate through all of them. Does that make sense what I'm asking?
But couldn't you do that in an array as well though? Couldn't you have 4 functions in an array with a number?
Yeah, probably. So you're asking something like this?
We'll just do
Yeah.
like age is age 4.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
And then how would you like iterate through and like calling them, but also getting age?
Okay, so this is not going to work. So wake up and eat breakfast, and then it tries to call something that is not a function. So instead of just blindly trying to call all these things in a loop, one option is just to check if it's a function. So I can use type of. Is that not right?
You just didn't have a parentheses.
No, it's not a function. Oh, the parentheses for the if statement. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if type of thing equals function. And we do the thing. Otherwise, we don't.
Do you see that like pretty frequently? Because a lot of objects have a combination, right? Of methods and just key value pairs. Or no?
Hang on just a second. This is not working for some reason. Oh, right. Okay, so the thing is a string. Things to do at thing might not be. Okay, there. So wake up, eat breakfast, but it checks that 4 is not a function, so it doesn't call it. So to answer your other question, you would probably not actually do this practically where you're just looping through an array and just calling all the methods unless you knew that they were all methods. So like you might have like an array of jobs or something. You say like do all the jobs. So you loop through the functions and call them all, but you wouldn't add something to that list if it wasn't a function. And so you might do that in some cases for an array, but for an object, I don't think I would ever do that. I would never loop through an object calling all of the functions in the way that I've done this here.
Why would you in an array?
Because arrays are for lists of things. It's kind of assumed that everything in the array is the same.
All of them would be, okay.
Yeah. So for an object, I assume that these functions all like do different things, or maybe they're not even all functions. So I would, go to them by name or by a variable name more directly. What other questions do we have? Any other questions? Going once, going twice?
Yeah, I've got a question.
Let's hear it.
This is just a formatting question, but when I was learning JavaScript, we always would kind of break up the lines using semicolons. Is that just like a best practices thing? Does that affect the code in any way? I just noticed that you haven't been putting those.
So in JavaScript, it is mandatory that every statement ends with a semicolon. But also in JavaScript, there is a feature called ASI, which is automatic semicolon insertion. So for the most part, if you don't put a semicolon at the end of the line, JavaScript will kind of like automatically implicitly put it in there. It just says like, I know what you were trying to do. There should be a semicolon here. It'll end the line. So generally out of laziness, I don't write semicolons in my JavaScript, and I've just kind of gotten accustomed to not seeing them. There are a few instances where you need them. Like in for loops, for example, you need the semicolons, like here. And there are some very limited circumstances where you'll write a line of code and JavaScript will get confused and think it's a continuation of the previous line. And so in those cases, it's important to use a semicolon, but I would be surprised if any of you encountered a situation like that in the course of this bootcamp.
Awesome. Thanks for clarifying that.
Yep. Okay, so this is all the content I've got about JavaScript to tell you this morning. So please ask questions about just anything we've seen this morning.
Just for best practice as well, for your for in statement, if we don't define it with const or anything like that, for example, when you put thing, would that ever affect anything really? Or should we do that, or does it really not matter?
Oh yeah, this is definitely bad. You should not do that. That creates a global variable. So you can see that this thing variable persists outside of my for loop, which is definitely not my intention. Const should crash it because I can't, wait, what? Okay, this is what I was talking about before. So I guess there is a difference in how the for in loop works under the hood versus like the regular for loops. And for some reason, you're able to use const to define thing, even though it gets redefined in every iteration of this loop. I think it's because it's like a different curly bracket scope every time. So you can like redefine the const variable. I wouldn't worry about it too hard. This definitely looks kind of weird. I would prefer to just use let, because I think that more accurately describes what's actually happening here. But yeah, what I really wanted to show is that using let or const makes this variable local to this for loop. So when I try to log it outside of that for loop, it's undefined. That is what I want. That's how most people expect programming languages to work. When I define it without any variable declaration, I've now made a global variable, and so it's accessible everywhere else in the program.
That's good.
So yeah, that is definitely a mistake to omit the variable declaration keyword there. All right. So let's see. We've got some homework for tonight. I'm going to stop recording, then we're going to look over this real quick.